I'm in Austin today attending to the Texas Tribune Festival. I decided to sit at a panel called Uncool. They will focus their discussion on a lawsuit that was filed to force Texas prisons to implement mandatory air conditioning. This lawsuit is filed by several prisoners, among them Bernie Tide. You must know him because you probably saw this movie in 2011 called Bernie by the director Richard Linklater. Richard Linklater will be there at the panel.
Today, in this state, there are 176 people on death row. Then we have what I call the unofficial death penalty. Those men and women we send to our prisons, often on a short sentence, who never make it out alive. In the last 3 years, 1,591 incarcerated people have died in Texas prisons. The majority were Black or Hispanic. The youngest was 16 years old. Most died from what the state calls natural causes or illnesses. This can mean anything from having a heart attack or dying of an infection or cancer to succumbing to extreme heat. Now, prison officials admit it's hot behind bars, and they really don't have another choice. Their own data shows it's the truth. I crunched the numbers, and 85 degrees. That was the coolest average temperature in an unair-conditioned prison last July. The hottest prison had 11 straight days of 100 degrees or higher in that month. And this is the heat measured inside inmate cells. The state prison department has recently admitted that high temperatures have at least contributed to the deaths of 3 inmates recently. None of those 3 was on death row. Elizabeth Haggerty was 1 month shy of her release. She was 37 years old when she died. The heat also hurts correctional officers. Extreme heat is the 5th cause of serious injury for staff and contributes to chronic understaffing at the agency. Now, this whole thing is the subject of a massive federal lawsuit. The judge here in Austin could make a ruling any day. And to be fair, this isn't just a Texas problem. There are lawsuits about this in Louisiana and Georgia, and even California prisons aren't fully air-conditioned. What makes Texas an outlier is that we have the largest state population of incarcerated people and some of the hottest summers. The prisons department says they're dealing with this with the tools that they have. They say they're providing fans and extra water. They say they're moving particularly vulnerable inmates out of the heat. But they also say installing air conditioning in every state prison may be a fool's errand, and definitely an expensive one. That's because we have more than 100 operational prisons in the state. Some are older than the Civil War, and even the newest prisons, constructed in the 1990s, were built intentionally without air conditioning. The prisons department needs money from the state, from us, from the taxpayer, to fix this. They say installing air conditioning statewide could cost $1 billion, but lawmakers have not given them the funding they need, and even if they had all of the cash in the world right now, today, they say finishing the job could take decades. So where does that leave us? Where does that leave the 134,579 people incarcerated in our state prisons? That's the subject of this panel. My name is Lauren McGaughy. I'm an investigative reporter and editor for the Texas Newsroom, a collaboration of all of the NPR member stations here in Texas. I've covered the issue of extreme heat in prisons for 12 years. I have to let you know that one of our panelists today, State Representative James White, is unable to be with us. He had another engagement that conflicted, and that's unfortunate because he's a Republican lawmaker, former head of the Corrections, chairman of Corrections Committee, so we were really hoping to get his perspective. We're going to start with someone with real lived experience in the state prison system. Marcy Marie Simmons is the Community Outreach Coordinator for Lioness Justice Impacted Women's Alliance. She's a mom. She's an advocate. She has a pretty massive TikTok following, so look her up on there. And she was incarcerated here in the state of Texas for 10 years. Marcy, You were in Gatesville prisons, many of the prisons in Gatesville. It's about an hour and a half from here. Last August, in the Murray unit, it was 97, 98 degrees for days. Tell us a little bit about what the lived experience in one of those cells was like.
I first want to address that number, 97, 98. Those are the numbers from the agency from last summer, the hottest summer in Texas for 10 years. Prior to that, 2 years prior to that, the documents out of that same agency on that same unit with no climate control was showing the average temperature 20 degrees higher than that for the month of August. So that just gives us a little bit of the kind of temperatures we're really talking about, Lauren. My last summer on the Dr. Lane Murray unit, the temperature in my dorm, and let me just say, they put the thermostats really high so that we couldn't see them, and they covered them with electrical tape. But one day when we had an officer that was not paying attention and we were able to get away with it, we climbed up there and pulled that electrical tape back, and it was 136 degrees in the cell where I lived. So that the kind of temperatures is far from a level of comfort. During those summers, it was 10 summers, I was incarcerated on non-climate controlled prisons. And during those summers, I saw women doing very extreme things to try to get a reprieve from the heat, as you can imagine. I was fortunate, I was fairly healthy when I went into the system, so I didn't, other than mental and normal physical ailments that one might experience, I didn't have any pre-existing conditions, but I watched women that maybe had diabetes or heart issues or other issues, seizures in the summer. We would see women just fall out from seizures. We would see the ambulances coming. We would see women doing, and including myself, the toilet water, if you flush it a few times, it gets cold. And that's the only cold water that we can splash on our bodies, and we would use that. I saw women even more desperately harming themselves to go to the crisis center that did have air conditioning so that they could get a break in those summer months.
It's the same problem for more than 100 years. I want to turn to Dr. Amit Dominic. She is the founder and president of Texas Prisons Community Advocates, an organization designed to support incarcerated people and their families and to expand knowledge about the prison system in the hopes of improving conditions. She's a researcher and former college professor who specializes in experimental, biological, and social psychology, and she spent 10 years in that building advocating on this issue. Dr. Dominic, the last two legislative sessions, the Texas House passed bills by huge margins to require air conditions be kept to between 65 and 85 degrees. The bills go nowhere in the Texas Senate. Take us inside the legislature. Who's to blame for not fixing this problem?
Ooh, that's a heavy question as to who's to blame.
I know. That's why I laid it right on you.
In Texas, we have a law called the law of parties, which assumes intent. I'm not a fan of that law at all. However, it occurs to me that there are several people who would probably be found guilty under that law in our legislative offices right now and throughout the state of Texas for ignoring this problem for so long. In the House, I will say 2 sessions in a row, we had bipartisan passing of the bill. So the House has been more progressive, more understanding, more compassionate about this human rights issue. However, we never get a hearing in the Senate. And I mean never. And Senator Menendez has filed that bill time after time. However, we just don't tend to get that hearing. Now, this last session, one of the things that took place is there was actually monies that were appropriated via the House to get 2 phases of installation of AC within the Texas prisons. By 2 phases of installation, I mean the agency was approached by the legislators to come up with a plan as to how much it would actually cost to put air conditioning in the Texas prisons. Now, just the fact that the legislators were just now asking for a plan, it makes a statement in and of itself. We really could not decipher exactly how much it was supposed to cost. The fiscal tax came in at 1.2 billion one year and 1.1 the next year. However, it just wasn't very clear. So those two phases of installation were approved by the House. They went through both chambers. However, in conference committee, those monies were removed. I can say, working with House members, particularly Senator Hoffman, has not been terribly receptive to this idea, and she is currently the chair of the Criminal Justice Committee. Also, upper leadership, Governor Abbott and Lieutenant Governor, have not expressed, and we've called for special sessions, we've called for additional help, we've tried to use ARPA money at some point, and still they've been pretty stubborn, saying things like, we can't do this. The plan since about 2018, and I wish Chairman White was here, because I remember that was the first time that I went to a hearing, and I was talking to him, and he said, well, the plan is to add monies onto the maintenance budget slowly over time. At one point, I had approached Director Collier, and I said, hey, can we work together on this? He said, no. The plan is to add monies to the maintenance budget over time. However, what happens when we're doing that is it could take upwards to 90 years to even get those monies added to the budget.
Yeah. Richard Linklater here at the end is a writer and director. You probably know from some of his movies like Slacker, Dazed and Confused, Hitman. You may not know that he grew up in Huntsville, Texas, which is literally the beating heart of the Texas prison system. If you want to learn more about growing up in a prison town, he just did the first episode of God Save Texas. You can watch it on Max. But today, Rick is here to talk about his friend, Bernie Tita. Folks in the crowd might remember Bernie from Rick's movie starring Jack Black. Bernie is currently serving 99 years for murder, and he's also the lead named plaintiff in the federal lawsuit challenging the hot conditions behind bars.
This lawsuit that's going on now, if you don't know much about it, be paying close attention. There's going to be a ruling soon, and I think it has the potential to be the most significant ruling about Texas prisons since the late 70s, the Estelle versus Ruiz, William Wayne Justice, for the people who remember that great judge. I think it's going to be that, knock on wood, but that hearing was pretty overwhelming, the evidence and all that. But Bernie's connection to this, it was a little over a year ago, early August, I had heard from his lawyer, Jody Cole, that he wasn't doing too well. I Zoomed with him, but I hadn't really visited him just lately. And I heard he wasn't doing well. Maybe he'd had a stroke or something. I was hearing bad things. So I went to visit him at the Estelle unit in Huntsville. I go back to my hometown. And I go in there, and I kind of got lucky. The guy who let me in was a fan of my movie, Dazed and Confused, and we were just talking about the movie, and he didn't get my phone.
He didn't check your bag?
He didn't. No, I just kind of waltzed in, and I'm sitting there with Bernie, and half his face is paralyzed. He's talking about the conditions, and I just sneak out my phone. I was looking around, and I start filming him, and I wasn't sure. It's a glass thing with a little opening, but I was able to get good sound. So I was so depressed and shaken by this visit, my, let's say, hour and a half with Bernie, but I did get him talking about the conditions, what he was living under, how hot it is, how miserable everybody is. And, he had a heat stroke, but they weren't saying that. They were telling him he probably had Bell's palsy, and because they never admit it. And I took that, gave it to Jody, his lawyer, and she immediately files a restraining order to the government and to get him into a cool cell, just an emergency medical thing. And we win. He gets it. He goes into a cell, a cool cell. And he's 65. He's a big guy. He's got diabetes. If you want someone who should be in a cold bed, it's him. But that victory gets the ball rolling. Jody gets in touch with Jeff Edwards, a guy who's had some success on these heat issues. They get in touch with this two attorneys out of Denver at big firms. Well, Erica Grossman, Kevin Homiak, he's the pro bono lawyer. I'm just going through all this to say that this kind of legal dream team sort of gets in shape with a lot of backing, what you have to do to take on something like the state of Texas in this issue. They have funding, Brandon Duke out of Houston and his firm. So it's these big, and it's they're so good. They just, all the experts, they put in those hundreds of thousands of dollars and all that time, and these people are passionate. I got really excited. I was on Zoom calls early, and the one important thing they do, they're not doing this just for Bernie. He's the plaintiff. They amended that lawsuit that Jody filed to include you guys, your organizations. There's 4 nonprofit organizations that are also the plaintiffs in this suit. So it's not a class action suit. Jeff had won that before. This is something different. I just think this is going to be a very important ruling, and it's going to really change things. Someone can take that into the future for their next, because Texas has to start feeling the pressure now. You know, so it's the only way it's going to happen is at the court legal, you know, level, I think.
There's been dozens of lawsuits filed about the extreme heat, actually. I've written about them going back almost 10 years, mostly inmates filing themselves from behind bars and going nowhere.
There was a big case it started in like 2011, 12, and it was settled in 2018. The PAC unit, he won that, a lot of wrongful death money, blah, blah, blah. They won that, but that was kind of localized for an older prisoners who had conditions. This one is like, no, every single human being who's behind bars, and that includes the corrections officers,
right,
deserves temperature control. This is just, they're going straight to 8th Amendment, constitutional, cruel and unusual punishment. They're going for that for everybody. It's broad. And they think if they can win in Texas, I was just talking to them from Denver. I mean, it's important these out-of-state people came in very specifically, because they're saying if we can win in Texas, we're going to win in all these other states.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So this is a big case. It's really important, and I don't know.
I want to hear from what y'all thought of what you learned during the hearing.
The first thing was the heat scores. How we actually assign heat scores or decide and a heat score basically decides who gets what's called a cool bed, and a cool bed is an area within the prison where someone sleeps that actually does have air conditioning. And I was astonished when I heard things from the physician who helped to create the algorithms for those heat scores, where we gave examples, our side gave examples of a person who is 90 years old and has hypertension, or a person who has diabetes, or a person who has epilepsy, and as an individual who's actually diagnosed with diabetes, and I understand my own heat vulnerability to the point where there's sometimes when we bring our mock prison cell around, I don't take my meds. I probably shouldn't say that out loud, but I don't, because I know that heat sensitivity. So for her to make statements where she said that, no, I don't believe these individuals are at increased heat risk, are at increased risk of death, on the back of all the experts, the professionals in that field that made it very clear the association between heat and heat risk and heat death, and how professionals look at that. So that was, I was floored. Honestly, at some point I just wanted to get up and yell, Google is your friend on that.
That was the first time we were seeing that heat score. It was an actual table laying out what puts you in a cool bed and what doesn't put you in a cool bed. So that was the first time the public was actually seeing that. Yeah, and then the next thing was the statements about their staff. You mentioned just a little while ago about the deaths of staff and the risk of deaths for staff due to the heat. And there was a comment at some point that, well, if they followed our training, they wouldn't have this problem. And I just thought, how do you continue to do this to your staff? Your mitigating factors, we're telling you they don't work, and it's on the back of your staff. Your staff have to bring the ice water. Your staff have to bring people to showers. Your staff have to bring people to respites. And just recently I heard about a staff member during a Hurricane Beryl where they were so upset that they started yelling, "Let me out of here," because of the heat the
and
staff
the conditions.
were yelling
the
that.
staff were saying that. And I'm thinking, as a leader, it was just that moment where, to be honest with you, I looked at Brian Collier and I just thought, I never want to be you.
The hearing, there were several things that stood out. So the plaintiffs put on their case for 2 days, and then the defense had 2 days. But during our 2 days, a plethora of experts, international epidemiologists and doctors, physicians, researchers, all of these huge minds from across the world came in, and they were all saying the same thing. 85 degrees or higher is dangerous for humans to live in. period. And what I loved is one of the researchers, she had all of this great evidence and all of these charts, and man, she was just given the information, and then finally she said, but you know what? I live in Texas, and all of this is common sense. Like it just really came down to common sense. There were a couple of numbers that those researchers put out, and we got to see some autopsy reports, which some of those autopsy reports surprisingly did not record a core body temperature. And the ones that did are shocking. The highest one was recorded at 109 degrees. There was a couple that were 107 degrees, and these are deaths that happened last summer when TDCJ is saying it was around 97 in their prisons, so that was really shocking to me. And then the defense, I think that there wasn't a whole lot to come back with, and so, they really didn't have anything. And then I just want to comment on these heat scores for one moment. So this heat scores that the Texas Department of Criminal Justice has in place to protect at-risk people from the heat. I want to note that our organization, Lioness Justice Impacted Women's Alliance, has 400 plus currently incarcerated members. The feedback that we're getting from our incarcerated members that have been incarcerated since before they started the heat score is they're not evaluated. They don't have one. So we're having women that have been there for 25 plus years and trying to get evaluated because they know that they could get some relief, and it's just not happening.
They're just trying to look good on paper, and they have these heat scores, they have these cool beds, they have all this, but what our trial really showed is all this is just kind of a smokescreen to just a losing, horrible system that all of it doesn't work. It's been proven in court. So Texas is really vulnerable now. They're on the record. They know it's bad. Is there one person in here that thinks anyone should have to live no matter over 85 degrees? I mean, everyone knows, well, local jails, federal prisons, animal facilities, you can't keep animals and things over 85, but there's this little law in Texas that the government, I think the biggest sin here in Texas, we made a big mistake 40 plus years ago, and we're all hoping this mistake gets corrected as they built the prison boom of the 80s and 90s. When I was a kid in Huntsville, there was like 18 prisons in the state, 7 of them in my county. Now there's 104. I mean, we had this huge expansion, and they had a choice right then, and they chose not to air condition the prisons. Like, I grew up in a little elementary school. We didn't have air conditioning. Of course, we're not in school June, July, and August. But I remember, fans, and they had, and that's how these old prisons from the 19th and early 20th century, they're built for that. But, pretty soon they air conditioned the elementary school, and they wouldn't think to build institution that didn't have air conditioning, the state. I mean, that's crazy. They don't build schools like that. But they decided to build prisons that way. And that's why we're here today. And they just have to reverse this huge mistake they made. And they're trying to cover up for it, but they're doing a really poor job. And it's really apparent if you dig right below the surface of everything. You read those autopsies, they're heartbreaking. Heat index 108, the human body found in a thing of vomit. It was 100 degrees in their cell, all that. And yet, heat might have been a contributing factor, but they died of drug toxicity, like an overdose, because everyone's on medication, right? Everyone in prison, and you're really vulnerable. 1/3 of the population that incarcerated have, mental health issues. Those psychotropic drugs are kind of the worst for, they're choosing, if you have schizophrenia, if you take your medication, you're 200% more likely to die from heat. So you have a choice to make. I mean, that's crazy that a human would, anyway.
Piggybacking on what you're saying about the medication, that was another thing that came to light. So as advocates, we get hundreds of letters from all over Texas around this issue. And they're saying things like they have to wet down their floors, and they've seen people pass out due to heat strokes, and what we saw in the lawsuit was the public to be able to hear those statements. Part of the reason I think why this is happening for so long is we need the community to get more involved, and the community to start telling the truth about what's going on in these prisons and their own personal experiences. We incarcerate so many people in the state of Texas that if somebody sitting next to you has an incarcerated loved one, and they probably don't want to tell you, and they probably don't want to speak out about this because of the stigma associated with it. These are real human beings. And I think that is really the crust of this whole issue, realizing that these are real human beings that we are incarcerating, that we are torturing, that this is premeditated torture. And I use that word premeditated because that is part of the definition where we convict somebody for murder. And common sense, and like I just want to piggyback on what was said about common sense. My grandmother always said, apparently common sense isn't always common.
Let's get real about fixing a problem that the prison agency acknowledges is a problem, that you all acknowledge is a problem. Some of these units are old. The average age is 40 years. The oldest prison is 175 years old. That's the Huntsville unit, built before the Civil War. They're all over the state. And the prison agency itself, in the hearing, they got $85 million from the legislature in 2023. They were unable to complete the number of cool beds construction by the end of 2023 that they had a goal, X number of cool beds by the end of 2023. They weren't even able to finish that with the money that they had because of, they said, logistical problems. There aren't enough contractors that want to do this kind of work. So I'm just curious about the fix from your perspective.
Yes. The lawsuit that Richard was talking about regarding the Wallace Pack unit, one of the things that happened during that trial was when that lawsuit was talked about and they did have to air condition that unit, Judge Pittman said, how long did that take? And they said 60 to 90 days, and he wrote that down. And so I want to point out that the workers are already there. They work for free for the state of Texas. They're behind bars. The labor is already there. So we need someone with know-how. Every single unit has an HVAC maintenance team that is maybe not proficient in installing something this big, but they are HVAC experts that certainly could get on top of that with a little bit of outside help. I was on the Henley unit the 6 months before I came home. They did recently air condition that unit. In 2021, I was there, and I was part of the team that ran electrical for the AC units. I mean, we were working. So I'm not understanding all the logistics excuses. Frankly, I don't even care about it. 14 people every summer are dying. That's what our experts. I don't even care about the logistics. Figure it out.
There's a temporary fix and there's a permanent fix that need to be addressed. We saw with Operation Lone Star that the units out, the Briscoe unit, and I can't remember the name of the other unit, how quickly Governor Abbott put temporary air conditioning in those units because he had to, because if not, he'd be violating the jail standard in place and federal standards. So, and it cost more than it should. By now, there's still temporary air conditioning in that unit. It's costing more than it should be costing. It would be much cheaper to go ahead and put the permit in there, right? So we have to look at how, if we were to just help the people who are suffering right now, that is possible. And I just want to say that at least it is possible. We know it's possible because we've seen it done already. Now, the next component would be the full air conditioning. I'm going to go back to quote my grandmother, where there's a will, there's a way. This should have been done decades ago. Some of these units, especially the ones that are built in the 90s, they already have the ductwork in there. I have heard from professionals who've asked to even donate air conditioning units and being turned down. So it's simply a matter of, if you want to get the job done, you can get the job done, and you can get it done faster than what you're claiming and probably more cost efficient than what you're claiming, as we saw in things like the PAC unit lawsuit, where there was, I don't want to take your quote, where they said it was going to cost $20 million to put air conditioning in that unit. It cost $3.8 million to put that in there. There's creative solutions. There's paint that can go on the outside of the buildings to help to cool things down in the meantime. There are solar panels that can be put up, and as Marcy said earlier, the labor's already there. So if they want to get it done, they can get it done. And like I always tell our legislators, what if it was your child? How quickly would you get it done? What if it was your dog? Or let's look at the pigs that have air conditioning for TDCJ. They got that done pretty quickly as well.
Yeah, PAC unit, they spend almost $8 million fighting the lawsuit that they lose, and then they air condition the thing for a little less than $4 million. Well, they could have done 3 units for that. And with this new lawsuit, I think the wrongful death amounts are going to go up and up and up. And the one thing maybe they can respond to on a fiscal level is we're going to spend this money. You know, if you want to jump a few years ahead, it can be in lawsuits and wrongful deaths and paying families because of their tragic loss, needless loss of their loved one. Or you can just fucking air condition the place, you know? And this thing, it's crazy. And they're throwing out, it'll be $1 billion, $1 billion. Well, let's just do the math. 3.8 for one, 70 units needed. That's less than $500 million. We got 20 billion in surplus, and it's a mistake we made. And you know, it's not an excuse. You know, there's a thing, our Constitution doesn't say, you can do the Constitution applies if it's in your budget. You know, if you don't, it's like, we don't have to follow that because we can't afford it. We built this. It's our institution. We built it. Sorry, it's violating your rights, but we just can't afford it. That's not an excuse in our world.
Yeah, and it's not an excuse to like the judge in Scotland who refused to extradite someone to the Texas prisons because he knows about the conditions. I think we also need to keep in mind in Texas, we're becoming a black eye not only throughout the United States, but internationally. We get people from the press from China, from Poland,
all over
from the
Europe.
UK,
Yeah. They're fascinated with how cruel, like, I guess the cruelty Olympics going on between Abbott and DeSantis and, you know, we're executing innocent people wantonly, you know, they're just like, hey, they're fascinated by how such a rich country can treat people. And we're a rich state, too. Texas, we got so much money. Look at our economy. Look at our wealth. Why are we acting like we're Mississippi?
Well, let's ask
we
that
can
question.
afford this. We can do this.
Do you feel like there's a moment now because of the lawsuit, because of whatever, because of it's something in the national psyche now that it's getting hotter, that people are paying more attention to this issue? But at the end of the day, the monies have to be allocated, right? Whether if the federal judge orders it or he doesn't. So from your experiences advocating in that building, and Marcy, I'll start with you as a formerly incarcerated person, did you feel like people were listening to you when you actually go and speak to people about this issue? Well, what have your interactions been like with elected officials?
Yeah, I think that there's a huge push right now that you know, because of previous advocacies, maybe I've been home since 2021, and so I know that there's also this uprise of formerly incarcerated voices being heard at the legislation. We have a lot of folks coming in testifying. We have a lot of people that have lived in that condition knocking on office doors, and I think that has helped the momentum. The feedback that I get personally from legislators is, first of all, when they see me, I usually get their ear because they don't think that I'm coming in as someone that's going to talk about prison, out of prison. And I use it to my advantage, you know, and so I go in and I get their ear, and I feel like they're receptive. And now the ones that aren't, at least they pretend to be.
Have you ever spoken with Senator, and this is for everyone, with Senator Huffman, with Senator Whitmire, with some of the people who, when you go inside that building, were the blocks that people pointed to for legislation like this?
So I've sat in front of that Criminal Justice Committee on the Senate side, in front of Senator Whitmire, Senator Huffman. They wanted to know about my crime. They wanted to know what I did to get in prison. They weren't very interested in hearing what goes on in prison. And it did feel like it's okay if laws are being broken against you if you ever broke a law.
Can I jump in with a Senator, now Mayor of Houston, John Whitmire quote? This was in the lawsuit.
It's your stage. Go ahead.
Yeah. This is, you know, about air conditioning in prisons. This is from 2011. I hope times have changed. We don't want to. Texans are not motivated to air condition inmates. These people are sex offenders, rapists, and murderers. So That's a Democrat back then. I also got in touch with his office asking if he wanted to amend his opinion over the years, but I haven't heard back.
You all are going to be the neighbors of those individuals who are coming back home from those prisons, who are coming out with increased medical conditions because we're literally baking their organs while they're inside. And you all also the people who their children are going to school with your children, and because they don't have a family member present in their home because their family member is incarcerated, they may be having some behavioral differences in their schools. And all this trickles back to how we're treating people in the prisons. And I also want to say very quickly on a political level, I think that this is no longer just a state issue, that what we need is a federal standard that clarifies the Eighth Amendment. Apparently, the state of Texas and other states don't really understand the definition of cruel and unusual punishment and indifference. And I believe that those things need to be clarified for our legislators, and we just need to continue to push harder.
I'm optimistic. I think there's such a groundswell of support, so much more awareness. You know, it was reported, I think even last week, not even in prison, just in American society in general, heat deaths are like, you know, the statistical line when they say they at hockey sticks, it's just gone up the last couple of years. Last summer was so bad. I talked to some people in government, and they said if one more person comes through the door and says we need to air condition the prisons, it's on everybody's mind. It's happening. And I talked to a state senator who said it passed so overwhelmingly in the House, and it didn't even come up to the Senate. But I heard, and you know, I don't know, it was really just Dan Patrick and the head of appropriations who said, we're not going to fund that. So it could be that simple. It could be one or two people just go, that doesn't sound right. I don't want to be that person who funds that. You know, so you've got to overcome that. And the only way to overcome that was just, we want them to get tired of hearing about this and how cruel and how the death count is really rising on their watch. Even though I don't know if we've mentioned this. Did you know no one's died in prison since 2011, is it? Supposedly? They died of medication, overdose, this, that, but but they did admit in court a few weeks ago that he thinks that some people died. But Texas, they just don't, they changed the definition of heat-related death. It's only if it's the sole reason. As if 130, you're being cooked, you know? But if you're on medication, it's the medication's fault. But the control group here, people who are in air conditioning, none of them are dropping because of medication things. You know, we have minimum 271 deaths, 0 deaths in AC, you know, so it's not even, that's what this lawsuit really did expose, all their shenanigans, all their obfuscations, all their just lies.
I just want to remind folks that the where we're at with the lawsuit right now is we're waiting for the federal judge to make his decision. He could really do whatever he wants. He could say, I'm not convinced, status quo. He could say temporary AC. He could say permanent AC or some iteration of that. If the state does not win at this level, they will likely appeal to the Fifth Circuit. So this is just the first step. The PAC unit lawsuit took 4 years from filing to settlement. So the lawyers acknowledge that, you know, we're on probably year one of a multi-year lawsuit.
Or they could just decide to fund it.
Or they could fund it at the legislature.
If one person could say, you know what,
go.
It passed in the House, let's just get this out of the way because we look so bad.
Have you heard anything from Bernie about effects he's experienced behind bars since the lawsuit has been
Not
filed?
really. At least he's in an air-conditioned cell. But tellingly, you know, Bernie didn't have a heat score. He's 65, all those conditions. He didn't have one. 90% of them don't have heat scores. And they, in court, they asked very pointedly, can you promise us this guy will never go back into an unair-conditioned cell? And they legally couldn't say that. They said, well, it's up to our medical. They couldn't say no. So that looked bad, too. So Bernie, he's not doing too well. He had another medical event, probably, you know, just, I don't know. I do worry about him, but that's what sprung this. You know, I thought I was seeing a friend die, and I know this issue, but that's what got Jody Cole. It's like, we're trying to save someone's life, and that's what we're all here. We're trying to save a lot of lives, and we're trying to have people not work and live in such torturous conditions. You know, there's 30,000 corrections officers. I had a stepfather who was a corrections officer. That's a tough job. And guess what? No one wants to do it. They quit. You know, Bernie says, we rely on those corrections officers to let you get the ice and do it, but they're not there because they quit, because they don't want to work in 110-degree heat. So it's a literal death spiral. There's not enough help to get the mitigation to help them get the cold shower and all that, because you need them, but then they're not there. They're understaffed because no one wants that job. So you couldn't design a worse system to defeat itself in every possible way. So it's a crisis, but it's pretty clear.
Right.
And I don't see anyone advocating for death in prison. You know what I mean? It's not like there's two sides to this even. We're just fighting a intransigent, machine that hasn't moved much.